Please, just pretend you're our dad for a minute. The whisper came so softly Marcus Reed almost thought he imagined it. The words floated across the small cafe table like steam from his cup of chamomile tea, fragile, uncertain, but impossible to ignore. Marcus looked up slowly. 3 identical little girls stood beside his table, their small hands clasped together as if they had rehearsed this moment 100 times before finding the courage to say it out loud. For a second, Marcus didn't move. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cafe windows, casting long golden stripes across the hardwood floor. Outside, a few cars rolled quietly down Maple Avenue, their tires humming softly over the pavement. Inside, the air smelled like cinnamon pastries and fresh coffee. It was the kind of peaceful place where people came to read a newspaper or finish a quiet conversation, not the kind of place where strangers asked a man to become their father, even if only for a moment. Marcus blinked once, then twice, trying to understand what he had just heard. The girls couldn't have been older than 7. Their hair was braided neatly, each braid tied with a pale blue ribbon that caught the light when they moved. Their jackets were identical too, soft gray wool coats that looked far more expensive than anything Marcus owned. Yet despite the polished clothes, their eyes told a different story. Wide, nervous, searching the room behind them every few seconds as if they were waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Marcus set his teacup down slowly, the porcelain making a faint click against the saucer. "I'm sorry," he said gently, lowering his voice so it wouldn't carry across the cafe. "What did you say?" The girl standing in the middle leaned closer to the table. Her voice dropped even lower this time, barely louder than a breath. "Please," she whispered again, "just for a little while." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't a man who ignored children. He never had been. Not even after everything that had happened. Especially not after everything that had happened. For years now, Marcus Reed had been the kind of man people barely noticed. 38 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered from decades of mechanical work, yet somehow invisible in a room full of strangers. He spent his days fixing city buses at the municipal garage 3 miles down the road, grease under his fingernails and the steady rhythm of engines filling the hours until his shift ended. And every evening, just before heading home, he stopped at this same cafe for a cup of tea. The routine kept his mind quiet, kept certain memories from getting too loud. But today something felt different the moment the girls approached him. Marcus studied their faces carefully. Triplets, he realized. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same round cheeks, same curious brown eyes, same small crease between their eyebrows that suggested worry far too big for children their age. "Why would you want me to do that?" Marcus asked gently. The girl on the left glanced over her shoulder toward the front door. The bell above it jingled faintly as someone stepped outside, and all 3 girls stiffened at the sound. Then the middle one turned back toward Marcus, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Because," she whispered, "he's coming." Marcus followed her gaze toward the glass entrance of the cafe. Through the window, a long black luxury sedan had just pulled up along the curb. The engine hummed quietly as the driver stepped out and walked around to open the rear door. A tall white man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit emerged from the back seat, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as he scanned the sidewalk with sharp, impatient eyes. Even from inside the cafe, Marcus could feel the sudden shift in the air. The girls moved closer to him instinctively, their small shoulders brushing against his arm. One of them reached out and lightly touched his sleeve as if anchoring herself to something steady. "Please," she said again, her voice trembling now. "Just until he leaves." Marcus looked from the girls to the man outside the window. Something about the way the girls stood beside him, tense, hopeful, afraid, sent a quiet ripple through his chest that he hadn't felt in years. For a moment, the cafe seemed to fall completely silent. The clink of dishes stopped. The low murmur of conversations faded into the background. Marcus Reed stared at the door, then at the 3 small faces waiting for his answer. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet routine of his ordinary afternoon was about to change in a way he never could have predicted. Marcus Reed did not stand up right away. He simply looked at the girls, then at the door again, feeling the weight of a decision that had arrived without warning. The tall man outside had not entered yet, but his presence already seemed to stretch across the quiet cafe like a shadow before sunset. Marcus could see the man speaking briefly to the driver, his movements sharp and controlled, the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being obeyed. Marcus had seen that kind of posture before, not in cafes, but in offices where people signed papers that changed other people's lives without ever meeting them. The bell above the cafe door jingled softly as a breeze slipped in through the entrance, and the girls flinched again. Marcus noticed the smallest one pressing closer to his chair, her fingers clutching the sleeve of his work jacket. The fabric smelled faintly of motor oil and laundry detergent, a scent that belonged more to a garage than a place with marble countertops and polished espresso machines. For years Marcus had lived a quiet life built around routines that did not invite attention. He woke before sunrise, drove his 10-year-old pickup truck to the city transportation yard, and spent the day under the metal frames of buses that carried half the town to work and back again. The sounds of wrenches, air compressors, and diesel engines had become a language he understood better than most conversations. Machines were honest. If something was broken, they told you. People were harder. People could hide things behind smiles, behind expensive suits, behind words that sounded polite but carried something colder underneath. Marcus had learned that lesson a long time ago. The girl in the middle tugged his sleeve again, gently but urgently. Marcus finally looked down at her. Up close he could see a faint line beneath her eye where a tear had recently dried, leaving a pale trail across her cheek. She was trying to be brave, but bravery in a 7-year-old looked different than it did in an adult. It looked like holding your breath and hoping someone bigger would understand what you could not explain. Marcus felt something stir inside his chest that he had spent years trying to keep quiet. Once, a long time ago, he had been the kind of father who knew exactly how to braid hair before school, and how to fix a loose bicycle chain in less than 5 minutes. Once, his evenings had been filled with small footsteps running across the floor of a tiny apartment and laughter that echoed through rooms that were otherwise empty. But life had a way of changing without warning, and the quiet routine Marcus lived now was built carefully on top of memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The door outside opened at last. The bell above it rang clearly, cutting through the calm hum of the cafe. The tall man stepped inside, bringing with him the crisp scent of cold air and expensive cologne. Conversations at nearby tables faded slightly as people noticed him. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms that immediately rearranged themselves around his presence. His eyes scanned the cafe quickly, searching. Marcus saw the exact moment those eyes found the 3 girls standing beside his table. The girls stiffened like deer sensing a sudden movement in the forest. One of them squeezed Marcus' arm with surprising strength. Marcus looked down at their small hands gripping his sleeve. Then he looked up at the man walking toward them with steady, measured steps across the hardwood floor. Marcus Reed had never planned to become part of someone else's story that afternoon. He had only come for tea. But as the man approached and the girls pressed closer, Marcus slowly straightened in his chair, resting one calm hand on the table beside his cup as though he had been sitting there with his daughters all along. The man stopped 3 feet from the table, the polished leather of his shoes barely making a sound against the hardwood floor, yet the tension in the cafe shifted instantly, as if everyone nearby sensed that something important had just arrived. Up close, the man looked even more imposing than he had through the glass. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, his silver-threaded hair combed neatly back, his charcoal suit tailored so precisely it seemed almost sculpted onto his frame. A thin watch gleamed on his wrist, catching the late afternoon sunlight that spilled through the windows. His eyes moved quickly from one girl to the next, counting them silently, confirming what he already knew. Lily, Emma, Ava. The triplets stood perfectly still beside Marcus, their small hands gripping the edge of the table, as though it were the only steady thing left in the room. The man's gaze lingered on them for a moment before sliding slowly toward Marcus. It was the kind of look that evaluated a person in seconds, measuring status, clothing, posture, and place in the world with quiet calculation. Marcus felt that look settle on him the way a mechanic felt a wrench drop into his hand before tightening a bolt. Not aggressive, not loud, just certain. The man spoke at last, his voice controlled and smooth. "Girls," he said calmly, though the calm carried a thin edge of impatience beneath it. "You wandered farther than I expected." The girls did not move. One of them leaned slightly closer to Marcus' chair, the fabric of her gray coat brushing against his arm. Marcus remained seated, his posture relaxed but steady, one hand resting beside his teacup. From where he sat, he could see the man clearly now. Richard Whitmore. The name appeared in newspapers often enough that even a bus mechanic who preferred quiet evenings and public radio had heard it more than once. Real estate developments. City contracts. Charity galas photographed under chandeliers the size of small cars. Whitmore Holdings owned half the new buildings rising across the county skyline. Marcus had never expected to meet the man in person, especially not in a neighborhood cafe where the most expensive item on the menu was a $12 sandwich. Whitmore's attention returned to the girls. "Your driver told me you stepped out of the car," he continued, still composed, still measured. "That was not part of the plan today." The girl in the middle tightened her grip on Marcus' sleeve. Marcus could feel the small tremor in her hand, the silent message children send without speaking. Whitmore's gaze shifted again, this time settling more firmly on Marcus. There was no open hostility in his expression, but there was something colder, something distant, the same look people sometimes gave Marcus when they saw grease on his hands and assumed they already understood everything about him. "And you are?" Whitmore asked politely, though the question sounded less like curiosity and more like a request for clarification from someone accustomed to having every detail explained. Marcus lifted his eyes calmly to meet the man's stare. He had spent years working in loud garages filled with men twice as stubborn as broken engines, and that kind of work taught a person patience. He did not rush to answer. Instead, he gently slid his cup a few inches aside, creating space on the table where the girls could lean closer if they needed to. The smallest of them looked up at him quickly, waiting. Whitmore noticed the movement. A faint crease appeared between his brows. The cafe remained unusually quiet now. The espresso machine behind the counter hissed softly as steam escaped, and somewhere near the window a spoon tapped lightly against a porcelain cup. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady and unhurried. "We were just having tea," he said simply. The girls exhaled almost in unison, as though those few words had given them a moment of shelter. Whitmore studied Marcus again, more carefully this time, his sharp eyes lingering on the mechanic jacket, the calloused hands, the calm posture that did not shift even under scrutiny. Something about the scene clearly did not match the expectations Whitmore had carried into the cafe. And as the quiet tension stretched between them, Marcus Reed realized that the simple lie the girls had asked for was about to become far more complicated than any of them had imagined. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the scene in front of him, the three girls standing unusually close to a man he had never seen before, a man whose work jacket and steady posture did not belong to the polished world Whitmore controlled. For several seconds he said nothing, and that silence stretched across the cafe like a thin sheet of ice. Marcus could feel the girls leaning against him now, their small shoulders pressing lightly against his arm, waiting for something he had not yet decided to say. The faint scent of chamomile drifted from his tea as it cooled on the table, the steam fading into the quiet air. Whitmore finally spoke again, his voice still calm, but carrying the authority of someone who rarely repeated himself. "Girls," he said slowly, "we have already discussed wandering away without permission." None of the triplets responded. Instead, the smallest one stepped even closer to Marcus' chair, her hand gripping the edge of his sleeve as though the fabric itself offered protection. Marcus felt the small movement and glanced down briefly. The child looked up at him with the same wide, searching eyes he had noticed before, silently reminding him of the promise she had whispered only moments ago. "Just pretend. Just for a minute." Marcus inhaled quietly, the kind of slow breath a mechanic takes before reaching deep into an engine to find the one bolt that will not budge. Sometimes the simplest solution was not the safest one, but it was the only one available. Whitmore's gaze shifted between Marcus and the girls again. "It seems," Whitmore continued carefully, "that my daughters have interrupted your afternoon." The word daughters landed differently this time. Marcus noticed the slight pause before Whitmore said it, almost as though the word required effort. The girls noticed it too. Marcus could feel the tension in their shoulders tighten. Marcus finally leaned back slightly in his chair, resting one arm across the backrest, as though he had been sitting there comfortably all along. The movement was small, but deliberate. It created space for the girls to stand closer beside him, which they did immediately. Marcus lifted his eyes to Whitmore with the same steady calm he used when explaining a complicated engine repair to someone who did not understand machinery. They were not interrupting, Marcus said evenly. They were keeping me company. Whitmore studied him again, clearly weighing the answer. The man was used to rooms where people adjusted their tone the moment he spoke, but Marcus' voice had not shifted at all. Whitmore's attention dropped briefly to the girls again. Lily, he said, addressing the one standing in the middle. You know very well that we have a schedule today. Lily did not answer. Instead, she tightened her grip on Marcus' sleeve and whispered something so quietly that Whitmore could not hear it. Marcus did. Please, she murmured. The word barely reached his ears, but it carried enough weight to settle the question Marcus had been turning over in his mind since the girls approached him. Marcus looked back at Whitmore. His expression did not change, but the tone of his voice softened in a way that suggested something far more ordinary than the tension filling the cafe. Girls, Marcus said gently, glancing down at them for a moment before returning his gaze to Whitmore. Your tea is getting cold. The girls understood immediately. They moved closer to the table, one of them sliding into the empty chair beside Marcus as though she had been sitting there all afternoon. The other two leaned against the edge of the table, their shoulders relaxed just enough to look natural. Whitmore watched the movement carefully, and for the first time a hint of uncertainty flickered across his otherwise composed expression. Marcus lifted his teacup again and took a slow sip before speaking. When he set the cup down, his voice was calm and simple. We were just finishing our tea before heading home. The word home hung quietly in the air between them. For a brief moment the cafe seemed to hold its breath. Whitmore's eyes returned to Marcus, sharper now, searching for something behind the mechanic's steady tone. The girls did not speak, but Marcus could feel them waiting beside him, trusting him to continue the small lie they had asked for. And as Whitmore stood there measuring the situation with the careful precision of a man accustomed to control, Marcus Reed realized that pretending to be their father for a minute had already begun to feel far more real than he had expected. Whitmore did not move for several seconds after Marcus spoke the word home. The single syllable seemed to hang in the quiet cafe like the final note of a piano that had not yet faded. Around them, a few customers pretended to return to their conversations, but their eyes drifted back again and again toward the unusual scene near the window. Whitmore's expression remained composed, yet the careful control in his posture shifted slightly, the way a man adjusts his stance when a conversation stops unfolding the way he expected. His gaze lowered briefly to the girl who had taken the empty chair beside Marcus. She had folded her small hands on the table and was staring at the surface as though studying the pattern in the wood. The other two girls remained close to Marcus' shoulder, standing so near that their coats brushed lightly against his jacket. Whitmore spoke again, this time with a tone that was still polite but far less patient. I believe there has been a misunderstanding, he said, each word measured carefully. Those children are under my care today. Marcus listened without interrupting. The faint ticking of a wall clock near the counter counted the seconds between their words. Outside, the black sedan remained parked along the curb, its engine humming softly as the driver waited. Marcus noticed the driver glance through the window, clearly aware that something inside the cafe was not going according to plan. Whitmore's attention returned to Marcus. You see, he continued, their mother entrusted their schedule to me this afternoon. I am certain they meant no trouble by approaching you. The explanation sounded smooth, practiced, the kind of sentence designed to close a situation neatly. But the girls beside Marcus did not relax when Whitmore said it. If anything, their shoulders stiffened again. The smallest one shifted closer and wrapped both hands around Marcus' sleeve now, holding on as though letting go would send her somewhere she did not want to go. Marcus looked down briefly, then back up at Whitmore. The mechanic inside him recognized the feeling instantly. It was the same moment that came when tightening a bolt that refused to turn. The pressure increased slowly, and sooner or later something had to give. Marcus folded his hands loosely on the table. They said they wanted to finish their tea, he replied calmly. Whitmore's eyes sharpened at the response. Tea, Whitmore repeated softly, as though the word itself were an inconvenience. He glanced briefly toward the counter where the barista stood quietly polishing a cup, pretending not to watch. Then Whitmore returned his gaze to Marcus. I do not believe I introduced myself, he said. Richard Whitmore. Marcus gave a small nod. Marcus Reed. Whitmore's eyes flickered for the briefest moment at the name, but he revealed nothing more. The pause that followed felt heavier now. One of the girls finally spoke, her voice barely louder than the clink of a spoon in a nearby cup. "Dad," she said quietly, the words soft but unmistakable. The cafe seemed to freeze again. Marcus felt the small weight of the words settle into the space between them. He did not look down this time. Instead, he rested his hand gently on the table beside the girl's folded hands, as naturally as if the moment had been rehearsed. Whitmore noticed the gesture immediately. His calm expression remained, but something colder slipped into his eyes now, something that suggested the situation had moved beyond simple misunderstanding. Whitmore took one slow step closer to the table. "Children," he said carefully, "it is time to leave." None of them moved. Marcus could feel their hesitation beside him, the silent plea they had carried since the moment they approached his table. The mechanic inside him recognized the moment again. When pressure reached a certain point, either the bolt loosened or the tool broke. Marcus lifted his teacup once more and took a slow sip before answering. When he placed the cup down, the soft porcelain clicks sounded louder than expected in the quiet cafe. "They will leave," Marcus said calmly, meeting Whitmore's gaze without raising his voice, "after they finish their tea." Whitmore stood very still for a moment, studying Marcus Reed as though trying to decide whether the man across the table was truly serious. And as the quiet tension stretched between them, it became clear to everyone in the room that the afternoon had shifted into something neither man had expected when they first walked through the cafe door. For a few seconds after Marcus spoke, the cafe settled into an unusual stillness. Even the espresso machine behind the counter seemed to quiet, as if the room itself were listening. Whitmore remained standing beside the table, tall and composed, yet the faint tightening in his jaw revealed that the situation was no longer unfolding according to the neat order he preferred. Marcus could feel the small weight of the girls leaning beside him, their quiet presence like a question that had already been answered in his mind long before he realized it. Outside the window, the late afternoon sky had shifted to a pale gray, and the first thin drops of rain began tapping softly against the glass. The sound was gentle, almost rhythmic, like distant footsteps across a wooden porch. Marcus glanced briefly toward the window. Rain had always brought him a certain kind of calm. Years ago, when life had been very different, rainy afternoons meant staying inside a small apartment with a little girl who loved to sit near the window and count the drops sliding down the glass. She used to laugh when the larger drops raced each other to the bottom. Marcus had not thought about those moments in a long time. The girl sitting beside him shifted slightly in her chair. Her small hand rested near his, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of it. The two standing beside him remained quiet, their eyes lowered to the table. Whitmore noticed the silence stretching and finally spoke again, though his tone had cooled further. "Mr. Reed," he said carefully, the name sounding unfamiliar on his tongue. "I believe this conversation has gone on long enough." Marcus turned his eyes back to Whitmore slowly. The rain continued to patter against the windows, soft but steady now. "Children," Whitmore continued, addressing the girls without looking away from Marcus, "your mother would expect you to return to the car." At the mention of their mother, something changed instantly in the girls. The smallest one lowered her head, and the one sitting beside Marcus tightened her fingers together on the table. Marcus noticed it immediately. A mechanic learns to notice the smallest change in vibration inside an engine, and the same instinct told him something deeper was moving beneath the quiet scene. The girl beside him whispered suddenly, so softly that only Marcus could hear. She would not. Marcus did not respond right away. Instead, he looked down at her gently. Her eyes were shining now, though she tried to hide it by staring at the table. Outside, the rain grew a little heavier, streaking thin lines across the window. Whitmore stepped slightly closer to the table. "I will ask one more time," he said with quiet authority. "Girls, it is time to come with me." None of them moved. Marcus felt the moment settle around them like the pause before thunder in a distant storm. He looked from the girl beside him to the two standing quietly at his shoulder. For a brief second, he saw something in their faces that reminded him painfully of a memory he had tried to bury for years. The look a child gives when they are trying to be brave in a world that suddenly feels too large. Marcus rested his hand gently on the edge of the table. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but carried a quiet steadiness that seemed to fill the small space between them. "Maybe," Marcus said slowly, glancing at the rain sliding down the glass before returning his eyes to Whitmore. "Maybe they should finish their tea first." The rain continued to fall, soft and patient, as the tension in the cafe deepened into something heavier than before. Whitmore watched Marcus with a look that had changed from polite curiosity to cold calculation. And though neither man raised his voice, everyone in the room could feel that the quiet afternoon had reached a turning point that neither wealth nor routine would easily undo. Whitmore did not answer immediately after Marcus spoke. Instead, he watched the mechanic across the table with a careful stillness that suggested his mind was recalculating the situation piece by piece. The rain outside had grown steadier now, thin streams sliding down the tall cafe windows and blurring the view of Maple Avenue. Inside the cafe, the quiet tension had settled into something almost tangible. A couple near the counter had stopped pretending to read their newspapers, and the barista stood very still behind the espresso machine, polishing the same glass for the third time while glancing toward the table by the window. The girl sitting beside Marcus shifted slightly in her chair. Her feet did not reach the floor, and the soft soles of her shoes brushed the chair legs as she moved. Her small voice finally broke the silence, barely louder than the rain tapping the glass. "We just wanted to sit here for a little while." Whitmore's eyes flicked toward her. The look was sharp, but he quickly softened it again, as though remembering that the room was full of witnesses. "Emma," he said quietly, using the child's name with deliberate patience, "that is not the plan today." The girl lowered her eyes again. The other two remained pressed lightly against Marcus' shoulder, neither speaking nor stepping away. Marcus noticed the way their breathing had steadied slightly since they moved close to him. It reminded him of the way children sometimes calm down when they believe an adult nearby understands something they cannot explain. Whitmore drew a slow breath and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve again, the motion small but practiced. "Mr. Reed," he said after a moment, returning his attention to Marcus, "you appear to be a reasonable man." Marcus did not answer, but he listened. Whitmore continued in the calm tone of someone accustomed to resolving inconveniences with a few well-chosen sentences. "These children have had a difficult week. Their mother passed away recently, and the transition has been complicated." The words landed softly but heavily in the quiet cafe. Marcus felt the girl beside him stiffen slightly. The two standing near him exchanged a quick glance that lasted less than a second, but carried far more meaning than Whitmore's careful explanation. Marcus looked down briefly, then back up at Whitmore. The mechanic's instincts told him that the explanation had been prepared in advance, the way some people prepare a statement before a press conference. Whitmore continued speaking. "Their routines are still adjusting. I have been entrusted with guiding them through this period." Marcus noticed something else now. Whitmore's voice was steady, but the girls were not reacting the way children usually did when hearing about someone who was helping them. Instead, their shoulders remained tight, their attention fixed on the table or on Marcus' sleeve. The girl beside him whispered again, so quietly that the sound almost disappeared beneath the rain. She did not trust him. Marcus heard the words clearly. Whitmore did not. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but his mind moved quickly. The story Whitmore had just presented was clean, controlled, and entirely logical. Yet the children standing beside him were reacting to it, as though it were something very different. Whitmore stepped slightly closer to the table again. "Now," he said calmly, "the girls and I will return to the car." Marcus looked at the three small faces beside him. None of them moved. The cafe clock ticked once, twice, marking the seconds. Marcus rested his hand gently on the table again and spoke with the same quiet steadiness he had used all afternoon. "They are still finishing their tea." Whitmore studied him for several long seconds. Outside, the rain continued falling, the sedan waiting patiently along the curb. Inside the cafe, the space between the two men had shifted again, no longer just a disagreement about schedules or tea. Something deeper had surfaced in the quiet exchange of whispers and glances. And for the first time since entering the cafe, Whitmore seemed to realize that the simple scene he had expected to control was beginning to slip beyond his influence. Whitmore remained silent after Marcus repeated the same calm sentence about finishing tea, but the quiet expression on his face had hardened slightly, the way glass becomes sharper when it cools too quickly. The rain outside continued to slide down the windows in long silver lines, turning the streetlights along Maple Avenue into soft, blurry halos. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as an ordinary afternoon had slowly transformed into a moment that everyone in the room could feel, even if they did not fully understand it. Marcus glanced briefly toward the window again, watching the rain for a second before looking back at the girls. The smallest one was still holding his sleeve, but her grip had loosened slightly now, as though the simple act of standing beside him had given her the courage to breathe a little easier. Whitmore spoke again at last, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "Mr. Reed," he said carefully, "you must understand that you are involving yourself in a private family matter." Marcus rested his hand quietly on the table and looked at him. "I am sitting with 3 girls who asked for company," he replied. "That is all." Whitmore studied him again, but this time his eyes moved more slowly, lingering on Marcus' jacket, the worn fabric at the elbows, the grease stains that refused to disappear completely no matter how many times they were washed. The look lasted only a moment, yet it carried a quiet judgment that did not need to be spoken aloud. The girl sitting beside Marcus noticed it too. She leaned closer and whispered something so faint that Marcus had to tilt his head slightly to hear it. "Mom said people show who they are when they think nobody important is watching." Marcus did not answer, but he felt the words settle into the space around them. Whitmore's gaze returned to the girls again. For a second, he seemed to consider speaking differently, perhaps choosing a softer approach. But the hesitation passed quickly. "Girls," he said again, this time more firmly, "your mother trusted me to make decisions for you." The girl beside Marcus looked up suddenly. "She trusted you to take care of us," she said quietly, her voice steady now despite the tremor earlier. "That is different." The words hung in the air like the echo of a bell. A couple at a nearby table exchanged a glance. Whitmore's expression changed almost imperceptibly, not anger exactly, but something colder, something that suggested the conversation had slipped into territory he had not expected. Marcus watched the exchange carefully. Mechanics learned to read problems long before they became obvious, and the tension unfolding beside him felt exactly like that moment when an engine warning light flickers on before the car stops completely. Whitmore inhaled slowly and straightened his posture again, the familiar mask of control returning to his face. "This conversation has gone far enough," he said quietly. "The girls will come with me now." The 3 children did not move. Instead, the one sitting beside Marcus placed her small hand gently on the table near his, the gesture almost identical to the way his own daughter used to rest her hand near his when she wanted reassurance without asking for it. Marcus felt the memory pass through him like a brief shadow. Outside the cafe, the rain began to lighten slightly, the rhythm of the drops softening against the glass. Marcus looked at the girls once more, then back at Whitmore. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the same calm steadiness that had unsettled the room all afternoon. "They are not finished yet." Whitmore stared at him for several long seconds. In those seconds something shifted again, not only between the 2 men but across the entire cafe. The carefully controlled explanation Whitmore had offered earlier was beginning to unravel under the quiet weight of the girl's words. And as the silence deepened, it became increasingly clear that the afternoon was no longer about tea or schedules at all, but about something far more difficult to control. The simple truth children sometimes reveal when they believe someone is finally willing to listen. Whitmore stood completely still after Marcus spoke again, but the control that had surrounded him since he walked into the cafe was no longer as perfect as it had been only minutes earlier. The rain outside had softened to a quiet mist now, leaving thin beads of water clinging to the glass windows. Cars moved slowly along Maple Avenue, their headlights glowing through the gray afternoon like distant lanterns. Inside the cafe, the tension that had filled the room for the past several minutes seemed to settle into something quieter, something heavier, as if everyone present understood that the moment had already revealed more than anyone expected. Whitmore looked down at the 3 girls again. For a long time he said nothing. His eyes moved from one child to the next, studying their expressions with a careful focus that suggested he was finally hearing something he had not wanted to hear before. Lily stood with her hands folded together, her shoulders no longer trembling but still tense. Emma remained seated beside Marcus, her small fingers resting near his hand on the table. Ava still held lightly onto the sleeve of Marcus' jacket, though her grip had become softer, almost thoughtful rather than desperate. Marcus felt the small warmth of their presence beside him and realized that the cafe, the rain, and the quiet afternoon had become something entirely different than the routine stop he had planned when he walked through the door earlier that day. Whitmore finally exhaled slowly and stepped back half a pace. The movement was small, but it changed the balance of the room. "Very well," he said at last, his voice lower than before. "If tea is so important, then you may finish it." The girls did not speak, but Marcus noticed the subtle shift in their shoulders, the way tension slowly eased from their small frames. Whitmore glanced once more at Marcus, and for the first time there was no quiet judgment in his eyes, only a long, thoughtful pause, as if he were reconsidering something larger than the moment itself. The cafe clock ticked softly on the wall. Somewhere behind the counter a kettle began to warm again, the faint hum blending with the distant sound of rain outside. Marcus lifted his cup once more, though the tea inside had cooled hours ago. He did not drink it. Instead, he simply held it in his hands, feeling the quiet weight of the afternoon settling around him. A few minutes passed without anyone speaking. The girls sat or stood near him as though the small table by the window had always belonged to them. Finally, Emma looked up at Marcus and spoke in a voice that carried none of the earlier fear, only a quiet sincerity that seemed far older than 7 years. "Thank you," she said softly. Marcus gave a small nod, but did not answer. Some things did not need words. Outside the cafe the rain had nearly stopped now. The sky remained gray, but a thin line of late sunlight had begun to appear between the clouds, reflecting faintly off the wet pavement. Whitmore checked his watch, then looked once more toward the girls. This time his voice sounded calmer. "We should go soon." Lily glanced at Marcus before standing slowly from her chair. Ava released the sleeve of his jacket at last, though she hesitated for a moment before stepping back. Emma remained seated for one final second, looking up at Marcus as though trying to memorize something. Then she stood as well. The three girls moved toward the door together, but halfway across the cafe Lily turned around. She looked at Marcus with a small, thoughtful expression that reminded him of someone he had once known very well. "You were a good dad," she said quietly. Marcus watched them walk toward the door, where Whitmore waited beside the entrance. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as it opened. Cool evening air drifted inside for a moment before the door closed again behind them. Marcus remained seated by the window, his hands resting around the cup that had long since cooled. Outside, the black sedan pulled slowly away from the curb and disappeared into the quiet street. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the pavement shining beneath the fading light. Marcus sat there for a few moments longer, looking out at the empty sidewalk, realizing that sometimes the smallest request spoken in a whisper could change an ordinary afternoon into something that stayed with a person far longer than they ever expected.